Yo, what's going on, Kicks Army? Today I'll be showing you guys how to draw the NMD Pharrell Human Race step by step. And then after the drawing is done, I'm going to go through some tips and some tricks to help you guys improve your drawings. Now, if anybody is curious, stencil for this sneaker along with the stencils for many other sneakers are available on my website, kickstarter.com. Like, literally everything on there is free. And as always, if you guys like these how to draw videos, make sure you hit that like button. If you are new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button and bounce past the bell to get post notifications. But without further ado, let's get it! Now you guys already know with these sneaker drawing videos, I want to make sure that we get these proportions correct. To maximize our chances of doing so, we're going to start off by drawing two squares right next to each other. You can make these squares as big as you want. The squares are going to be the outside dimensions for the sneaker. And you can either use a ruler for these or you can just kind of eyeball it, do whatever works better for you. And then we're going to divide those two squares into top and bottom halves. Afterward, we're going to add a vertical line dividing the bottom right hand quadrant into halves as well as that initial left box. Finally, we're going to add one more horizontal line dividing the two bottom quadrants into halves, and this will give us all the guidelines that we need to draw out the rest of the sneaker. Now, I personally like doing the silhouette for the sneaker first because I feel like this makes it much easier to proceed with the rest of the sneaker drawing. And with all the lines that I'm drawing, make sure you look at where I place them in relation to where we have the guidelines, especially the intersections of the lines. That should make things much easier for you. So notice how when we get closer to the tongue, we don't go all the way to the top of the borderline. That's because this is low top sneaker. It doesn't need to go up that high based off of the two box dimensions that we're starting with. And as I'm working on this part where the sock liner is, you're going to notice how I kind of rearrange my lines slightly to make sure it looks good. This is just the pencil stage, so you're not bound to any decisions that you're going to make because we're not inking anything just yet. Next, we're going to add the heel. Notice how it has a curvy motion. It's not a straight line. We want to have it curved. It looks much more natural that way. And then we're going to close off the silhouette by adding the back part of the outsole. And notice how much sharper those outsole lines are as opposed to the upper. Now we're going to start working on the details of the inside of the sneaker, so we're going to start with the outsole. For this part especially, you want to use that last horizontal line that we made as your guide. Notice how towards the left it starts off by going on top of that line, it dips down underneath it halfway, and then it meets that line at the very end all the way to the right. Make sure you give that line a nice flow to it. It should flow all the way through. It shouldn't be too jagged. Then we're going to add a line that's parallel to the bottom of the outsole. This line would actually represent the outsole itself, where what's above it would be the boost area. Nothing too difficult here, just following that line. Now we're going to start adding those rectangular sections that connect the midsole to the upper. Again, look at where I place these lines in relation to where the guidelines are. And it adds more realism if you give the top of these two rectangles a little bit of depth, so that way it doesn't look like just a rectangle. If you put a little bit of depth on the top, it gives it more realism because it shows some dimensionality to it. And then in the middle of both of those rectangles, you're going to add a very long thin rectangle. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be there. Now we're going to work on that panel that connects the two rectangles on the side. Notice how the left side is pretty straight, but the right side of that whole triangle area gets pretty curvy. Now we're going to actually start to define that cage area. Notice how there are no sharp corners on the inside line for the cage area. Every single corner is rounded. And again, take your time. You don't have to rush this part, especially since this part is pretty much the most important part of the shoe, since this part pretty much defines the upper. Now we're going to start to add some of that wiring that's going to be within that space. Good rule of thumb for this is you want to have 9 columns and 3 rows. As long as you try to space these out as evenly as you can, you should be just fine. And then the space that's in between all the columns and the rows, those squares / rectangles that we have are going to be the spaces that we're actually keeping. The columns and the rows intersect, we're going to erase all that in the end. But it's much easier to do it this way as opposed to making a bunch of squares and trying to figure out where the placement is. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to start adding those iconic laces. Notice how the laces at the bottom start within those squares, because on the actual shoe itself, those laces go through those squares, so your drawing should also replicate that as well. And you can add as many laces as you want. This is your drawing. I only have 4 that really go over the shoe itself, and then I have that one extra lace go inside the sock liner. And after that, you are pretty much done. The drawing should already be done. From this point on, the next stage is the inking stage, which is the most important stage because now we actually have to commit to these lines. Afterward, we have the coloring stage, which is always my favorite part of the drawing because that's when you really see the entire drawing come to life. That's how you take this two-dimensional drawing and you make it slightly less two-dimensional, I guess. I don't know, with the proper shading, it can look three-dimensional, but that all depends on your skill and your comfort level of actually shading. Now for outlining purposes, I use micron markers. The reason why I use those markers is because there's a lot of different widths that they come available. I purchased mine at Michael's, but I'm sure Hobby Lobby has them. Walmart might even have them in the crafting section. And I'm sure any of your local art retailers has them as well. The particular thickness that I'm using is 0.45 millimeters, but I will say these markers are kind of expensive, especially if you're kind of on a budget. What I started using from my outlining that I used for a lot of my drawings initially was an ultrafine Sharpie. And they should have these almost anywhere. I bought them at Walmart personally, and I think you get like a 2-pack for like $3 or something like that. It's really cheap. And I always recommend using the ultrafine Sharpie whenever you're doing outline detail as opposed to a regular Sharpie, because it's just so much cleaner that way. Unless you're doing a really big drawing, if you're doing like a regular sheet of paper, it just looks a lot better to use the ultrafine Sharpie. Otherwise, in my opinion, the traditional Sharpie is just too thick. Another quick tip about the outlining too, whenever I do the outlining, I never just go over one part just once. I'm usually going over the same small section 2 or 3 times to make sure the ink really stays. Especially if your marker's kind of dying out, you kind of need to. It does kind of seem like a pain in the butt at first, but trust me, you get really used to it, and you want to go over each part more than once because you want to really make sure those lines are clean. The only thing I hate about inking when I'm filming these videos, because I can't really turn the paper at all because I have it stayed still with tape, and because moving my body doesn't really work too well based on my desk setup, it makes it very hard to get some of these lines really clean. If you're drawing this at home, I mean, by all means, you can go ahead, you can rotate the paper as much as you need so that way you always have a good angle to approach these lines. And ready for this? Here's another tip. Let's say hypothetically you have no money and you don't have any access to markers. You can use your pencil for outlining. But the key to that is if you're going to use your pencil for outlining, whenever you draw the actual sneaker itself, you want to make sure that you go easy on the lining. You don't want to really press down too hard on the pencil, because the harder you press down, the harder it is to erase. And by default, whenever we're drawing, we're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to have to erase at some point. So if you want to make it easier on your job to erase the marks that you don't want, you're going to want to make sure you go super light with the pencil initially. And when you're using a marker to outline, you don't have to worry about that because you can just erase whatever you don't need. The marker is going to stay on the paper. As a super cheap solution, pencils work pretty well. Now for the inking phase. This is my favorite part. You know why? Because this paper is going to go from boring to slightly less boring real quick. Now whenever I'm dealing with a section that is white, right? So let's say the outsole is a perfect example. I've learned over the years that if you just leave that section white, it looks very dull. So there's a very easy way to kind of go around this. And that easy way is just using a very light gray. So for example, I'm using Copic markers, so I use Cool Gray, so I have Cool Gray 1 and Cool Gray 2. What you do is you kind of hug the bottom part of whatever that section is, and you kind of marker upwards, so that way you give it a nice enough light stroke so it creates the illusion of depth. And ready for this? Let's say that you can't get your hands on these markers, or another marker that's a Cool Gray that's light enough that's an equivalent. There is another hack that you can use. It's called your pencil. Think about it, your pencil is essentially a gray. Because we're dealing with a pencil, the harder you press down, the darker the pencil mark is, and vice versa, the lighter you press down, the lighter it will be as well. So like literally take your pencil, go to the bottom of whatever section it is, lightly press against the paper and just kind of feather it upward and upward, and you can see it happening. That's how I learned to shade. I learned to shade from a very young age, not from drawing sneakers, but from drawing flowers. I know, super lame, but just hear me out. Whenever I would draw flowers, I would always practice my shading with each petal. Flowers have a lot of petals, especially if you draw them with a lot of petals. So because I drew my flowers with a lot of petals, I had a lot of opportunities to practice shading. And because petals aren't really that big of a space, you don't have to worry about committing to a big space and having it look bad. Like if one petal looks bad, you have 20 other petals you can make on the same flower or whatever you want to do. And then once you feel like you've already advanced past that petal stage, what I did is I focused on spheres. So I drew a circle, the best kind of circle I could draw, it doesn't have to be perfect. And then you slowly start to shade the bottom of that circle, and then eventually it creates a sphere based off of the shading. Shading will make a huge difference in your art, and especially in your sneaker drawings, I'm telling you guys. You can do this with markers. I used Sharpies for a long time and I was still able to get some shading done. Although it's much more difficult, here's how you do it. Like literally, whatever markers you use, if you go over the same area multiple times, that color gets deeper and deeper because you have more layers of the same color. So perfect example, the upper, it's all green, but I'm using only 2 markers. I'm using a green that's lighter and a green that's slightly darker. You don't want 2 completely different colors because it makes it a lot more difficult, but if you pick 2 colors in the same family, it works out very well. So I'll go over each section one time with the lighter color. I'll add some details on the bottom of this section that provides the shadowing, and then I'll go back with that lighter color green and I'll blend everything in. Like that upper probably has a good 6 or 7 layers towards the top, and then towards the bottom I might have like 12 to 20 layers. And like guys, like I'm a modest guy, but trust me, I know this shading looks good. Like when you saw me put down that green initially, you're like, ew, this kind of looks kind of bad. But now look at all that blending, look at all that work. You know why it looks good? Because flowers, that's why. I could literally title this video how flowers changed my life, but then y'all think I lost my mind. One more thing before I go, it's very important that you color in the same direction. Coloring in the same direction saves a lot of ink and it doesn't look bad. Even if you have to go slow, just color in the same direction in a very tight zigzag line, and trust me, it looks so much better that way. And usually in terms of sneakers, especially if it's a big open spot like the upper of this shoe, you want to go vertical, not horizontal. But even if you're gonna go horizontal, I'd rather you go horizontal and not go 5 different ways trying to color in the space. Like, take your time, trust yourself, I know you guys can do it, and go easy on these lines. But that's going to do it for today's video. If you guys enjoyed the video, leave a like. If you are new to the channel, hit that subscribe button and bounce past the bell to get post notifications. Don't forget to check out Kickstarter.com for all your sneaker stencil needs, as well as checking out a bunch of the other videos I have on the channel. I have a full playlist of how to draw videos, over 60 videos I think that I'll link at the end of this video. And I will see you guys tomorrow. Yay!